Watchmen, Chapter 1, All the Agents. The first issue begins with two detectives checking out a crime scene of a murder that happened earlier that night. The detectives quote how the victim, one Edward Blake, had, quote, muscles like a weightlifter, and that he surely would have put up some sort of fight before being tossed out the window to his death. This sequence ends up being the process of Edward Blake's murder. While this is happening, the reader sees panels of this man being beat up and then thrown out to his ultimate death. The detectives then conclude that the murder must have been perpetrated by more than one assailant, or one guy on serious drugs, as one of them states. It is then said that they should keep this case quiet as to not attract a certain vigilante aspect that could and would interfere with the case. They then enter the elevator and ride it down to the ground floor. We then see the two detectives walking down the street and chit-chatting about the case and about the vigilante Rorschach and how he would muck things up if they were ever get involved. We then cut to a panel where we see that before mentioned vigilante grabbed the very button that was evidence from the murder, which itself was a smiling face button, which is also what the story of Watchmen is associated with. The vigilante we see is known as Rorschach. Rorschach then reveals what appears to be a grappling gun and shoots it up at the apartment of the slain man. Once he arrives in the apartment, Rorschach begins to look around, although we aren't privy to know what he is looking for at the moment. That is until we see him go in the closet and push a concealed button. This button then opens up a hidden room and reveals what was once a vigilante known as the Comedian's uniform along with multiple weapons and personal artifacts. Rorschach lays the uniform out on the ground and observes it. We are then brought to the home of the former Night Owl known as Hollis Mason. We see Hollis recalling memories with the man who would later become the second Night Owl, Dan Dryberg. The two Night Owls chit-chat for a while about times past and how Hollis presented the fact that President Nixon and the Keene Act forced the vigilantes to retire early and stop the crime fighting. The conversation eventually concludes and then Dan leaves for the night. He then arrives home and sees that the lock on his front door has been broken. Wary to see who it would be, Dan walks into his kitchen and he sees Rorschach eating a can of beans. After his quick snack, Rorschach shows the button that belongs to the comedian and tells Dan how the comedian had been murdered. Not feeling comfortable, Dan asks Rorschach to pick up the conversation down in the workshop and away from prying ears and eyes. They discuss who could have murdered the comedian, but ultimately they have no leads to go off of yet. However, Rorschach is on a mission to change that. The two men depart each other, but not without Rorschach throwing a verbal jab at Dan and making fun of the fact that Dan quit being a vigilante when Rorschach did not. The retired and overweight Dan sits with a sad expression on his face, knowing that his glory days are long behind him now. We are then transported to a rooftop where we read Rorschach's notes that he writes into his journal. He talks about how society is collapsing and he writes the famous journal entry, "Tonight, a comedian died in New York." Rorschach enters the shady bar and approaches the bartender. "Rorschach, how you doing, fella?" the bartender nervously asks. A troubled youth in the crowd starts making remarks towards Rorschach. Rorschach then approaches the man, grabs his hand, and demands that the rest of the bar crowd tells him what he wants to know. Who killed Edward Blake? The crowd looks nervously on as Rorschach breaks more and more in the man's fingers. The crowd swears they know nothing about the murder. Rorschach begrudgingly accepts his answer and exits the bar. Rorschach visits the man named Adrian Veidt, who himself is the vigilante superhero Ozymandias, the smartest man in the world, and questions the man on who would want to murder the superhero known as a comedian. They don't come to a concrete answer. It is at this time where Rorschach critiques Adrian about how he sells posters and action figures of himself and that he is a sellout. Rorschach then leaves by exiting via the window that he entered in. Rorschach then breaks into Rockefeller Military Center and is going to extreme lengths to visit the God Among Men, Dr. Manhattan, and his girlfriend, Laurie, also known as the superhero Silk Spectre II. Dr. Manhattan initiates a conversation, and Rorschach tells the Doc and Laurie that the comedian has been murdered and that they could be next. They then get rid of Rorschach via Dr. Manhattan's transportation abilities. Laurie then calls Dan Dryberg and asks him out to dinner, to which he says yes. We then cut to Rorschach walking in the slummy part of the city and monologuing to himself about good and evil and ultimatums and a never compromise, not even the face of Armageddon. Dan and Laurie go out to dinner, time goes forward, and then Laurie and Dan talk on the rooftop patio discussing old times. The chapter then concludes with Dan commenting on how there's no laughs around anymore because the comedian is dead. Like and subscribe for part 2. Thanks.